Hi, I'm Em.
And my name is Bea.
And this is
Fangirls Anonymous. A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome.
Hello, Bea. How's it going?
Pretty good. How about you, Em?
We're doing a fun little episode on betas, and not the editing kind. We've already had an episode entirely dedicated to the betas who edit for people, but and we kind of had an episode about betas in our ABO series, which is what this is about. But we didn't really get into like the nitty gritty of what betas are when you're talking about the ecosystem of ABO. So we have decided to do an extra episode for ABO fans out there on what betas are within the context of ABO and why they're so weird. Like, even within the concept that most people consider the weirdest thing regarding fic, which I disagree. Even within that, you still have this kind of middle child. Yeah, this middle child that most people don't understand very well.
Yeah.
But before we do any of that podcast homework, we have our podcast on Apple. If you listen to us on Apple, please go ahead and write a review if you'd like. It's always nice to see how people respond to what we say on this podcast. We also have a Patreon. If you are interested at all in supporting us monetarily, then go ahead and look us up. You get our episodes a day early, which is fun because, you know, our episodes are cool. If you're listening to this episode in season 3, you might think that our episodes are cool. And also, if you have just some extra time, go ahead and read those 3 5+1 fics that we made our fic club for the beginning of this season. Go ahead and read those. They're really fantastic. I'm not going to I'm not going to restate the titles because they're really long, but
they're in the show notes.
They're in the show notes, promise. Go find the links. They're really, really, really good. And then send us your comments, analysis, whatever the hell you'd like. Even if you hate them, please send us an email saying why you hated them to mmbpresents@gmail.com. All right. Welcome to the show. This episode is gonna be fun and weird, just like the topic.
So, we're talking about betas as I'm gonna use the word gender here because we don't have a good linguistic term for it, which exists in Omegaverse, also known as Alpha, Beta, Omega, or ABO. I'm gonna mostly call it Omegaverse, and they're pretty much interchangeable terms. And if you want to know more about what Omegaverse is as a whole, we have a whole series of episodes that we did that I would recommend that you listen to and maybe read some of the links or just go out and read some of the fic, because honestly, it makes a whole lot more sense in context, gotta be honest. But when we were talking about it, we realized that, well, alphas and omegas, which are kind of the backbone of the trope, are pretty specific and have a lot of similarities across different stories. Betas are weird. Like, we were trying to figure out how to define what a beta is, and we were really struggling because the most concrete thing that anybody has from story to story about betas is that they are not alphas or omegas. And that's about it.
It's true. It's so weird. Like, we're gonna get into it, but like, betas are one of those things where it's almost like it was originally a part of the trope, but because of certain like reasons and because of certain like likes in the audience, they've almost been phased out of the stories.
Yeah, I would argue, I have no research to back this, that betas originally were, like we said, not alphas and omegas. They didn't have a title or anything. It was alphas and omegas that were weird and needed a title in order to explain what they were. But because they were outliers, it was assumed that everybody else in the story who wasn't actually stated to be an alpha or omega was everybody else, like a normal human that you would expect. And of course, because the entire trope originated on bad science, they looked at what they'd already used and went, okay, so betas, not the lowest part of the pack, not the highest part of the pack. It's the middle people, so everybody else. And it sort of never really moved past the idea of everybody else. It's a matter of what everybody else is that changed. Because I think in the original stories it's fair to say that everybody else was the human race as we know it. But as people started trying to figure out world building, and we realized that, hey, maybe in this universe, what we think of as a normal baseline human being isn't what they think of as a normal baseline human being. Maybe alphas and omegas are your normal baseline human beings and betas are something else.
They're the odd men, odd people out.
And women.
Yeah.
Very, very much so. There are a couple of things, I would say as a rule of thumb, because alphas are defined basically as the gender with a penis and a knot. That is not betas. Betas are not that. And generally, but not always, they don't have the same kind of estrus cycle, so no heat or rut, the way that alphas and omegas do. Not to say that they don't sometimes. That's the weird part. This is not a hard and fast rule. And that is really what differentiates them. I guess you could also say that generally speaking, male betas can't get pregnant the way that male omegas can, which is also not a hard and fast rule. Insofar that I've read ABO stories where male omegas can't get pregnant, so see, it's a gray zone. Everything is a probably not, but I've seen exceptions.
It's truly 50 Shades of Grey. It's a lot of different shades of gray. Maybe not 50, but yeah.
So I gotta be honest, the Watsonian reasoning for what these are, so your in-world reason in the narrative for who and what they are, is usually pretty complicated. Are they baseline humans and alphas and omegas are something that is cropped up like mutants in X-Men, or is it they've always been this third gender, or is it that I've seen the analogy to worker bees, that they are people who don't reproduce and can't, and
I've never seen that.
I've seen it sometimes. Or that they can only reproduce with other betas, and they can't with alphas and omegas, because the genetics of Omegaverse are a frigging nightmare. But so the Watsonian actual reasoning behind it I've seen is varied and sometimes confusing. I've seen people do whole extended theoretical evolution for why these traits existed, and then trace a theoretical path of migration for the people who had these traits, and why certain groups, ethnic groups, display certain traits more readily than other ethnic groups. And it's fascinating, and I've seen other people who basically never mention betas, and they basically don't exist. Because, fun fact, Omegaverse implies the existence of betas, but it doesn't necessarily need them. I've definitely seen just Alpha Omega, no betas at all.
Strange. I mean, for me, that's weird because, it's obviously, it's ABO, but, betas are kind of, in my head, growing up reading fic and seeing ABO and reading ABO quite early on, betas to me are kind of this, not qualifying necessarily, but they're this, neutral kind of part. It's it's to me, betas were people who weren't so controlled by their hormones all the time and could kind of do a lot of things that omegas and alphas, it was harder for them to do because of their hormones and because of their physiology. But when it came to procreation and production and stuff like that, you had betas, they could kind of be both. In my head, I considered them verse because they're the middle, right? They can both get somebody pregnant
Mm-hmm.
and get pregnant, which I thought was really interesting. Like, I liked that, and it was kind of weird for me after a while to realize that no authors were exploring that concept. So it isn't
Mm-hmm.
until recently that I realized maybe that shouldn't have been an assumption of mine.
Which is part of the reason that they're interesting, which I want to circle back to. I feel like it's important, though, to talk about the Doylist explanation for them, though, because I feel like for all that authors sort of... Yeah, I'm using a lot of big literary words. I apologize. I feel like for all that authors kind of bend over backwards in narrative to make betas make sense, in terms of the actual narrative itself, its structure, and how they deal with characters, betas tend to have a very straightforward role, which is they aren't included in the romantic and sexual relationships. And this can be for a lot of different narrative reasons, but generally speaking, that's what they're there for, is to basically take them off the table because they're not an alpha or an omega. Which you'd think, hey, if you made both of your ships omega characters or alpha characters, that would do the same thing. And it doesn't. It's interesting. Take, for example, what's a good fandom? Let's say Teen Wolf, because Teen Wolf has a very interesting relationship with the trope.
Yes.
You make Derek an alpha and Styles an omega, sure. You make Jackson a beta, because there are, believe it or not, some people who shipped Jackson and Styles together because apparently they like a bully-victim relationship. It is what it is. I will cast no shade on that one. But by making him a beta and then explicitly making your preferred ship Derek and Alpha, you've suddenly created this compatibility and kind of edged Jackson out of the story. He's this neutral quantity, and honestly, that's what I see the most. If there are betas at all mentioned anywhere in the story, it's usually to keep one character out of the running as a part of the ship, without explicitly putting in the narrative work to do so.
Yes. Or it's just to be like, texturally, these are the people in their lives this way. So like a lot of authors like to say, like, a lot of authors, you're reminding me of reading a lot of Steric fic, where it's like, not only do you have ABO, where humans go, like, turn into, not turn, but they have, like, their predispositions, right? But you also have werewolves who not only have ABO, but they're also werewolves, and there's pack hierarchy involved in that. So when an author is, like, writing a Steric fic regarding, and it's not an AU, it's like there are werewolves involved, then they have to, like, decide who is who, like, which one is which A, B, or O. And a lot of the humans end up just becoming betas or omegas, and there aren't that many human alphas involved. It's like you have to decide which personality fits which denomination, or it's so funny to me.
Or whether you should flip it on its head too, because that's one of the interesting things you can do.
It's like housing in Hogwarts. Like, now that I think about it, it's like,
pretty much.
Is he a Hufflepuff or is he a Slytherin? Like, it's so funny.
Yeah, it's honestly one of the cool things about it, I think you hit on, is because it's this neutral quantity. Whatever neutral means for the story, you end up having all these really interesting things you can do with it, because it's a third gender. It's no longer a binary.
Yes.
So you can do things like you can play around with people's expectations, because now suddenly it's not, obviously this is a more masculine or a more classically feminine set of people that we're going to assign these other traits to. It's, okay, what if they're neither or both? And how do we play with that? How do we make it work or not work? It's really fun, actually, because like you said, when you were originally reading it, really went in with this idea that, hey, betas can, to a certain extent, do it all. They're not as particular as an alpha or an omega. I went in with the idea that they're the happy medium. They And that means that they don't need to do it all. Like, they can happily abstain.
Yes, exactly. Like they're not controlled by their hormones as much as the other two.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's this neutral muddy zone in the middle, so it's actually really fun to pick up on the idea of, okay, what if, yeah, alphas and omegas really are controlled by their hormones? How does you structure a world around either most people are like that and a couple of people aren't, which, some interesting things being said there. Or what if you flip that and say most people aren't? Most people are regular humans and only a couple of people are alphas and omegas. Because they both have some interesting things to say. And if there isn't any kind of a status difference, if it's people are what they are, how do they reconcile in like social groups how you're supposed to act? Because I feel like it seems more realistic to most people if human beings have rules around your gender norms. So, is a beta supposed to be?
Sorry, I will say that if it's a teen wolf fic, then it tends to be a third of a third and a third. Like it's like I don't really know the numbers though in supernatural fic where the trope comes from. Not quite sure, but
Mm-hmm.
I found in a lot of like found family pack kind of situational steric stuff, teen wolf stuff. It's like maybe there are slightly less alphas than there are omegas and betas, but they're generally about the same. It's like genetics.
Yeah, it's a different kind of a society that builds up when you've got a third and a third and a third, as opposed to, let's say, 10% of the population is alpha omega and 90% of people are not. Suddenly you've got a minority group, a fairly significant minority group with a very different set of needs. Like, it's a completely different world building experience, and just because you're playing with ratios, and you
Yeah,
couldn't do that if everybody was still stuck in that binary. Like, it's
yeah,
the betas really make it fun to mess around with, because depending on what you're doing, you can say, okay, maybe betas are going to be a thinly veiled real world allegory for asexual people. You know, they don't
maybe.
really want to participate, they don't biologically uh, being given incentive to do so, and they're just living their lives. Maybe it's your betas are, like you were saying before, maybe they're verse. Maybe they're people who have a lot of different sexual preferences. You could say that there's a very thinly real world allegory for pansexual and bisexual people. Like, you can do a lot of interesting and fun things with betas because the rules are a lot less solid when the only thing you have to go on is they're not alphas or omegas.
Absolutely. And also you can just have like it almost becomes like an ABO fic where it doesn't really matter. Like you as an omega you can fall in love with a beta or an alpha. As an alpha you can fall in love with a beta or an omega, and if you're a beta you can fall in love with both. Like it like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
And maybe you don't. Maybe,
Yeah, maybe you fall in love with a beta.
yeah, maybe you can have. There are infinite combinations of things that you can do, and it can say a
Yes.
lot of different things. I think the thing that's really cool about it is how to phrase it. Suddenly, alphas and omegas aren't just, men in a different form and women in a different form with some distinct biological differences. I'm talking more social roles. Now you have to make room for a third, which is neither, and in doing that, you start asking questions. You
Yeah.
kind of have to, especially depending on how you structure a beta, because just because a lot of times it's assumed to be a baseline human, I've seen versions where betas do have overt estrus cycles, the same way an alpha and omega do, but they don't have them as strongly, and they don't. It isn't as big of an impact on their life. I've seen versions where, like, the scent thing doesn't affect them. Like, they can't smell whatever alphas and omegas are putting out and are just oblivious to that, making them very much outside of that mode of communication. Like, I don't know, it's interesting because you have to ask how is this third thing working, and how societally does it function?
So in a lot of fic, authors, especially younger authors or inexperienced authors, tend to write a pairing, especially if it's, I have found, male-male, where one of them is very much the masculine person and one of them is very much the feminine person. But when you're dealing with ABO, yes, we have the more masculine alpha and the more feminine omega, which it's always fun when that's dumb, right? Because a lot of times authors tend to make that situation like society is backwards and these characters I'm writing about are trying to like buck society's opinion on like that omegas are like demure little like walking wombs, you know.
Some really, and it is going to sound really bad, but dollar store feminism.
Yeah, it is. It's still fun to read though, in my opinion. But
yeah, I mean,
betas,
it's still good, it's just not
yeah,
well thought out.
yeah. But betas are where the author has to seriously think about society's opinion on whether it's incredibly important as to whether somebody can get pregnant or not. That is a much more nuanced thinking process about the society and the world building that they're doing. And it just means that you're getting a lot more out of this world than you would have if you if your fic is only about alphas and omegas, because at that point you're just talking about men and women, really, even if it's two guys or two girls or two non-binary people, right? Betas allow authors the ability to, or kind of make authors, betas make authors think about gender in their ABO fics, more so than you would think than if it was just alpha and omega. We talked about this a little bit in our previous series, but it's important to talk about this relationship between gender and like being sexual in ABO because they're so intrinsically linked.
I feel like betas also have this unique ability to ask in-world questions that are sort of integral to the trope itself, because Alpha Omega by default has some questions about consent. It just does. Yes. That's the way the trope is structured.
Yes.
But by having the existence of betas who are either not as affected or maybe not affected at all by these consent issues, you have the ability to start really interrogating this world about how it deals with consent and what that means to these to characters. You can also start asking some really poignant questions about sexuality and how that relates to, a biological impulse or some biological compatibility, which really gets back into queer spaces. Because let's say that you have an omega who's in heat, and via the trope, you're supposed to have an alpha around to help fix it, I guess, is the best way to put it. But what if they're in love with a beta, and they physically can't do it, and they still make the choice to be in love, to have sex, to whatever? Especially because now it's no longer this biological impulse, so there has to be the consent there. So it's really interesting what you can do with betas. There are a lot of, by having a neutral party in the middle, you can start asking hard questions of these worlds. How they work, why they work, what's the real guts of some of their issues, how does that relate to the real world? Having said that, some not so great things about betas are how much that doesn't happen. Betas, there's a reason Alpha Omega exists. It's actually really easy for betas to basically just not exist in story, which is somewhat tragic.
If they do exist, though, in a fic, then it's almost exclusively people in the background. Like we were talking about this before the episode started. In Supernatural, where this fic or where this trope originated, it's almost always Cass is an alpha, Dean is omega, and Sam is a beta. Almost always. If he's not, he's also an omega. And then everybody around them are, one of the three. But like, it's mostly just other characters that end up being betas, and almost never the main ship, which is really interesting. Because why do that's a question on whether why we pick certain characters to ship or not. Like, does one character just seem more like a girl and the other character seems more like a masculine person? I don't know. It's weird. Anyway, please go on.
Yes, I think sticking characters in the pre-established gender binary that we understand is very much a thing that we as fandom as a whole still do, which is a bit sad. But it is somewhat tragic to me. I was looking for Rex and I couldn't find almost anything that had the main ship, one of them being a beta. Like, it's sad because there's a lot of characters that I'm like, actually I kind of want to see what would happen if one or the other of them were betas. I've seen it occasionally, and a lot of times it's used briefly. Like, honestly, it's mostly smut. But occasionally it's used more along the lines of a character, like, losing being an alpha or an omega. Like, it's a weird metaphor for, like, being castrated, and that one's pretty rare. To be completely honest, I've only ever really seen that in, like, with Captain America, where, honestly, he's got, like, a whole trans metaphor thing going on, so it's further complicated, but it's kind of sad that you don't have more characters that are asking those hard questions, because it does weirdly lend itself to a queer in a queer reading of some of these stories. The one which I will not rec because I couldn't find it, that was actually kind of one of my favorite investigations into the gender roles in ABO is actually a fic in which Steve is an omega, Bucky is an alpha, Natasha is an alpha. It's mostly smut, but it is also an investigation of the fact that they don't conform to their roles, because Steve is kind of a dick the whole time for reasons. So it's not so much an investigation of him, but Natasha is pretty dang ace. Like, she will have sex if she needs to, but because she's a super assassin spy. But she doesn't do it for her own self, despite the fact that, based on the way the trope works, it's a biological impulse. And Bucky, who is an alpha, doesn't enjoy being an alpha at all. Like, he gives him dysphoria. He would rather be a beta. All of which is really interesting, and couldn't find it again. Might try and hunt it down for the show notes later, but...
I could not fucking find anything regarding beta characters in the ships that I have read. And I don't have it in me to rec something I haven't read, so I'm not going to do that, because I can't recommend it. Anyway, it's interesting to me that we don't have a lot of important characters being betas. I mean, I would say Sam is an important character, right? But we just don't have it.
How often when he's a beta is he like a really big part of the story where he's not a kid or like very clearly just a peripheral support character?
Yeah, he's almost always already married to Joe or Gabriel or whoever the fuck he's with.
Which is, I think, one of the downfalls of betas in fic.
Yeah, how?
Is I think that the most frequent thing that it does really poorly or propagates really poorly is kind of the opposite of what we've been talking about, because there are so many cool things you can do with it. And I feel like what most people do is to use it as a really transparent narrative means of kind of shuffling certain characters to the side. So they're either not interfering with the romantic narrative or kind of taking a minimal part in it. If you are talking about... It's often used if it's a family member. Like, if you don't want them to be involved in the drama and they're not explicitly in like a maternal or paternal role, often they end up being a beta because it's just easier to deal with them narratively when they're not kind of stuck in with your main characters usually appearing in whatever drama they're going into, or it ends up being something you do to what it would typically be kind of a romantic rival so that the reader knows they're off the table, that they're not going to be part of the romance. So for a really good example, and I'm going to preface this with Omegaverse in the Batman fandom is a slightly different ecosystem. Every fandom has its own little tweaks. The Batman fandom's a little weird. It's the only fandom I've ever encountered familial Omegaverse in. But
Oy.
basically in it's actually really interesting, but that's a whole different topic. But in basically every Omegaverse fic I've ever read, Alfred is a beta. Always. And yeah, part of it is because sexualizing Alfred Pennyworth is a sin against nature, but part of it is they really are like, he is in a paternal role, but he's not explicitly paternal the same way, depending on the story, Batman or someone else is. And you don't want him to be in that role in most stories. So they're like, it's much easier to deal with him if he's just a beta, a neutral, calming, supportive presence, but not part of the shenanigans. In terms of like a romantic rival, I used earlier a Teen Wolf example, but let's use another Marvel example. A decent amount of the time you get Sam Wilson as a beta, which pretty firmly puts him off the table in terms of any rivalries, despite the fact that strictly by narrative relationship, he should be a romantic rival with Bucky Barnes or Tony Stark or whoever you're deciding to ship. Specifically Steve with. I mean, he could be a romantic rival to lots of characters. But by making him a beta to usually their alpha and omega, suddenly he's biologically incompatible, so it doesn't matter anymore. Which feels lazy. Like, I know it's a shorthand and it has some use, but after talking about how many cool things you can do with this third gender, it feels kind of cheap to have these characters that are like, oh, they're betas. They're not a part of this. We don't have to worry about them.
Betas are like, they're like this is how people treat them in fic. They're like the inherent best friend character in every movie.
Yeah, they kind of are.
Yeah.
And it's the worst, because like, it's a third gender, y'all. We don't have well, okay, we have lots of genders.
Yes.
But we don't have one that's
we don't have an established
it's not as widely accepted.
We don't have an established societal third gender yet. Like, it's just not a thing that most people consider. So to have that like baked into this trope, why the fuck are people not using it? It's so weird. Like, everybody loves talking about how fan fiction is like super off the rails and like gets deep into weird stuff that a lot of people don't talk about in the normal daily lives. And yet there's this third other gender in this crazy trope and nobody's talking about it. Oy. I'm off my soapbox now.
Yeah, so yeah, I don't know, betas are wild. Because you go into it thinking that the weirdest thing about Omegaverse is the alphas and omegas, because, yeah, those are wild too. And then it's like these quiet, unassuming betas in the background, and you're like, what is that? And nobody knows. Nobody can answer you.
It's like the world that they live in made alphas and omegas have to fuck each other in order to have to make kids. And they needed this third other group of people to take care of them.
There's another really interesting, I guess, set of ideas that, again, fairly rarely used, in which relationships are actually by default triads in a world. I've read about a fic where it's because of the way reproduction works, there's literally 3 parents. But I've also seen it as sort of a societal answer to the non-consent or the inherent dangers of not being able to consent during an estrus cycle, where betas aren't affected, so there is, yes, a partner, but also sort of a referee. to make sure that everybody's safe and, is able to get out of your violent estrus cycle intact. And so it's
they're like bodyguards.
Suddenly, no, they're more like they're the person who decides when you safe word out. Like, you have impaired judgment, so they're there to make sure that everybody is safe. Because there is an inherent dangerous quality to the idea of Alpha Omega heat rut cycle, because, hey, everybody's got impaired judgment. So they're there to basically be like, everybody goes in their timeout corner. You go in the cold shower, and you need to drink some water, and everybody calm down for 5 minutes. We'll get back to it. Like, that's their job.
I have never seen that before, and I really want to read that. Like, bad.
Not super common, but it is. But I kind of wish it was. Because, again, a society where there is a societal niche for somebody who isn't an alpha or an omega.
Okay, so we just haven't gotten to this topic yet, but it's important, I think. Race. Race metaphors in the Omegaverse.
Yeah.
Beta's kind of complicated a little bit.
So, we talked about it, I believe, some in our kind of core Omegaverse series, that Omegaverse in general has kind of a bad relationship with race. It takes a lot of the narratives that are very core to certain race identities and kind of takes them without really thinking them through. Like, Omegaverse has a fairly close relationship with, like, a slavery AU, and that's not always great when your characters that you're shipping are all white people. Especially two white men. Not great. So, it's one thing when it's pretty clearly, okay, alphas are the oppressors and omegas are the subjected. It's another thing when you kind of add betas in there, because, is that just another bystander group who, like, don't have an in? Like, are they people who are just trying to avoid also being subjugated? Like, you've stumbled into some real-world gray zones with this one, people. It's not a great look. I mean, it's not a great look when it was black and white either, but so many questions when you introduce this third population group.
Are they like the small business owners when considering Marxism?
Excellent question. I very much don't know where to put them in the narrative, and it doesn't make things better. It doesn't help. It just mostly looks like the story really hasn't examined what it's talking about in a lot of different ways, which is kind of sad. I mean, gotta be honest, slavery AU Omegaverse is not my favorite in the first place for a lot of reasons, but all of you authors out there, just please examine your narratives, know what you're relating to in the real world before you make the choice to write it. Not that you shouldn't, just know what you're getting into.
Try to examine everything you're writing from a point of view that isn't your own, which obviously some people would theorize is impossible, but it is hard. But just recognize where your stories are coming from, maybe. And it's okay to do that. It's okay. Yeah, betas are super weird.
Mm-hmm. They haven't got any less weird for trying to unpack them.
No, they have not. I would say a lot of authors consider them kind of an enigma when it comes to ABO, and they don't necessarily know what to do with them. Do whatever the fuck you want with them, please. Do as much as you want with them, or as little as you want with them, but use them. I think like betas should absolutely be used in ABO fic. It's in the name.
Mm-hmm. Yes, like even more so than the idea that they're different than alphas and omegas. Like, there's a wealth of interesting things because there are no rules. Mm-hmm. So just I want all of you Omegaverse authors out there to tuck that in the back of your mind, that you should write a really awesome fic about a beta character or characters. Please. I want to read it.
Hell yeah. We would love to read it. Send it to us. If you write something like that because of this episode, please send it to us. Oh my god. And if you are listening and you have just the most amazing beta fic out there, or the most amazing fic that has anything to do at all with betas, like as the forefront, send it to us at mandbepresents@gmail.com. Okay, so it's time for Rat Corner! And it's only you this time, Bea.
Yeah, we searched, my friends. We looked through, in my case at least, hundreds of summaries of fics I have read, trying to find you guys even one that was about a beta pair, not even just a beta pair, like a beta in a relationship in the story in a more than a background way. And I am very sad to say that I failed. The only one I could find is honestly sort of a cop-out, and I apologize now. It's still a really cute story, so you should still read it. It's called I Want Your Hot Love and Emotion by Squeaky, and it is a story in which I'm gonna call it Omegaverse, although feel free to argue about that, because it is a world in which alphas are basically just males, omegas are basically just females, regardless of their presentation and everything else, and betas are actually intersex, so they have both reproductive systems, which is more traditionally like what you would assume an omega male is, or possibly, depending on the world, an alpha female. They still have, like, estrus cycles and so on, but the story is about Alpha Bucky, who unexpectedly goes into heat in the middle of a bar, and Beta Steve, who decides to Good Samaritan and bring him home so that he's not gonna start a fist fight. And one thing leads to another, and Bucky ends up having to take off in the morning, leaving Steve with no way to contact him, and kind of brokenhearted because they made a real connection there. Literally. I don't believe it technically counts as Shrinky Clinks because Steve is still Big Steve. That's one of the emotional tensions in the story, actually. But he is not a superhero. He is an ER nurse. Bucky is still a superhero, I believe. But it's really cute. It has some plot, some smut. It has a beta in a different way than traditionally one would think of betas, and I'm going to stick with that is the reason why I chose it.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, no, it sounds really good. And weird. Just like betas. Right?
Yes. I would agree to both of those statements.
Yes. Okay, so I don't have any because not only did B fail, but I failed even harder, which is awesome. Love that for me. Okay, thank you to everybody who's listening. We really appreciate you listening in on season 3 of this podcast, and we can't wait to continue doing more episodes for it. I think that we're done, though.
Yeah, so I guess we'll see y'all next week on
Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!